Hello, everyone. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's topic, we'll be discussing IVDR Essentials, Performance Evaluation Report, Early Planning and Preparation. Our presenter today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in Biochemistry and a PhD in Molecular and Cellular Biology, with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. And with that, I would like to welcome Sarah to give an overview of our session today. Welcome, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. So as a disclaimer for our session today, we're presenting this from the point of view of being seasoned MDR-compliant CER writers. So a lot of what we are presenting as far as strategies for aligning with the new IVDR requirements are based on our extensive experience preparing these same types of sections and same documents in the CER world. So this presentation seeks to help you assess your PER processes and your documents for possible gaps prior to your submission. By the end of this presentation, we hope you have a chance to strategically review the PERs that you're preparing to ensure that you have a clearly stated purpose statement, a clear documentation of your methodology, as well as a logical flow in an organization. So as we assess our PERs for IVDR alignment, we hope to review certain commonly observed gaps in the following sections: in the clinical data sources, in your state-of-the-art section, in selecting proper performance objectives, and in conducting a thorough risk-benefit analysis. And then finally, we'll discuss why organization and having a solid PER template and structure really matter. So for many companies, the PER might be a brand new concept, and it can definitely feel overwhelming. So we'll begin today's webinar with a very high-level review of the purpose of the PER. The purpose of the PER as defined by IVDR is to provide evidence that your IVD is safe, effective, and may be considered state-of-the-art for the intended use in clinical indications. So how does the PER actually accomplish this? Ultimately, you need to present a thorough, critical review of product-related documents, results of internal studies and tests, any published clinical literature that you've identified through systematic literature review, and any available post-market data. But the PER is not just a series of data reports that are all stapled together. The notified bodies expect a complete documentation of your process by which you collected, extracted, and compiled each of these data sets. That's why organization is critical to ensuring not only that your PER is complete, but that it flows well and it's easy to read. It's hard to know really where to begin with planning for writing a document as complicated as a PER. In our experience, many of the important decisions need to be made prior to even beginning the writing process, particularly with regards to clinical performance objectives and data sources. Do you even know what documents are available to you? Have things like your IFU, have they been finalized? There are going to be a lot of moving pieces, and they're often spread out between different departments and divisions within your company. So as you begin to assemble the necessary input documents, we suggest that an early important decision should be made regarding your intended purpose. So that's where I thought we'd begin today, is whether or not you have clearly defined the intended use of your IVD. First, how does IVDR define intended purpose? This is a main difference between IVDD and IVDR definitions. It lies with the addition of that last statement in IVDR. The IVDR defines the intended use based not only on your IFU, but also on the results of the data presented in the PER. So your PER is expected to support the claims that have been set out in your instructions and in your promotional materials using all available clinical data sources. What is clinical data though? And how much information do you actually need to collect to truly define and support your IVD's intended purpose? We get that question of data sufficiency a lot as medical writers. According to IVDR Annex 1, there are several types of data that can and should be used to support your intended purpose. So first and foremost, you're looking for data regarding the analyte you're detecting. What is it? What is the function of this analyte? So that can include specific information in the context of a physiological or a pathological state, congenital or physical or mental impairments, predisposition to a particular medical condition or disease. It could also help you in establishing safety and compatibility with recipients of a particular therapeutic or treatment. It may predict treatment responses or reactions. And it may also be used to monitor the efficacy of therapeutic measures. So there are a lot of different ways that these analytes may be used, and a lot of that will depend on your specific type of test. But you're expected to discuss how your test provides these types of information. And you should expect to present a complete description of other alternative diagnostic options. Those aren't your competitors, but they're alternative methods for providing relevant diagnostic information. And then finally, you should be prepared to describe the intended user as appropriate. Is this a self-test? Is this a test that's designed to be used by laboratory professionals or by healthcare professionals? Is this a point of care test? Is this an at home? All of those things play into a thorough description of your intended purpose and use. And in our role as medical writers, we're often asked by our clients to help clarify what the difference is between a product's intended purpose and a product claim. So a device-specific intended purpose, as indicated in your IFU and in your labeling, serves as the basis for all product claims. IVDR Article 7 clearly states that the manufacturer is prohibited from misleading the user or the patient through a product claim about the device's intended purpose, safety, and performance. So that brings us to the importance and the whole concept of clinical evidence. How can you use clinical evidence to support these claims to help you clearly define and support your intended purpose? So here again, I'll refer you to IVDR. In Annex 1, they state that it's the manufacturer's sole responsibility to define appropriate clinical evidence. And that includes the intended purpose and use, as well as the environment where the product is used. So how does intended use link to clinical evidence? Really, the intended purpose and use is fundamental to building your performance evaluation plan because it includes information such as what is detected and measured, what is the function of the analyte, and all of the other information we just discussed. So your intended purpose directly drives the level of performance evaluation, the types of clinical performance studies, as well as your post-market performance follow-up activities. Ultimately, the intended purpose will drive many of the critical decisions made during the PER writing process. Early strategic planning requires that you're prepared to make decisions regarding the availability of sources of clinical data, as well as the sufficiency of that data that you will need, a complete assessment of the diagnostic landscape, including alternatives and competitors, and carefully selected performance objectives that will help you identify and support your risk-benefit assessment. So we'll start with that first point, which is where do we look for sources of clinical data? In speaking with a lot of our IVDR clients, clinical data is a real point of concern. Many companies are struggling with the concept of data sufficiency, and often they worry that there is no clinical data to be found. And that can be particularly challenging for Class A devices or de novo tests, or really any test that's used for a wide range of clinical applications. So today we'd like to just review some simple strategies you can take to identify and present your clinical data. In our previous webinars, we've provided a very detailed description of the process and the methodology of conducting a systematic literature review. And that is ultimately the collection of all of this published clinical data. So instead today, we're going to focus on how the clinical data fit into the PER as a whole. So what is clinical data and how much is enough? Those data, this can include those data that have been identified through published literature or other publicly available sources, including registries. It could include PMS data that's been passively collected through your post-market surveillance processes. It could also include PMPF data that's derived from a proactive post-market data collection activities that are conducted by the manufacturer. And it also could include some manufacturer-held clinical investigation data, although some companies say they don't have that type of clinical investigation data. The purpose, though, of the clinical data that you're including in your PER, that's clear. You need to demonstrate that there is sufficient clinical evidence to establish safety and performance of the subject device under evaluation. So there's a lot packed into that statement, though. So, for example, what exactly is the measure of data sufficiency? And how do you go about identifying those key safety and performance standards? And don't forget that whole concept of data sufficiency standard. That has to be met for all indications for your IVD. And that can be especially challenging if within your claims, you state an indication that is part of your claims document, but is not yet supported by all clinical studies. That may necessitate additional manufacturer-held clinical investigations in the long term. The methodology of how each of these clinical data sets are identified, weighted, and appraised also needs to be very well documented. So be sure to establish the relevance of each data set to your subject device and ensure that there are consistent time ranges for the data sets across all data sources used in your PER. Each source of clinical data needs to be presented in its own section. So don't commingle the presentation and analysis of different types or sources of your clinical data. And finally, because each data set must be presented within the PER and should be analyzed against your safety and performance requirements and the acceptance criteria, that means you can't simply cut and paste analysis and conclusion statements that have been taken from another internal document, such as your PMS report. Those analyses are not relevant to the overall analysis required by the PER. Which brings us to the topic of analytical versus clinical performance indicators. Now is a good time to discuss how that clinical evidence can support both the APR as well as the CPR, but also help to distinguish how these data are different from one another. This is a very common area of confusion for our clients. It's that relationship between the three reports that are required for IVDR. There you have the APR, the SVR, and the CPR. And for some devices, the CPR may not be required, particularly for Class A devices. So that can add an extra point of confusion for some. The term clinical evidence by itself can be confusing because a clinical study is sometimes just a broad blanket term applied to any study collecting or using patient samples, independent of those performance indicators. But an analytical performance study utilizing patient samples is still an analytical performance study. It's not considered to be a source of clinical performance data. So the recommendation is therefore to use specific and clearly defined terms, such as calling it an analytical performance study or a clinical performance study, as opposed to referring to your data broadly as just clinical data. It will help you to clearly define the purpose and the goal and the types of evidence that are being collected in each of these different reports. The analytical performance will present data relevant to the ability of the IVD to correctly detect or measure a particular analyte accurately. The scientific validity will provide evidence supporting the association of that analyte that you've just detected with a clinical condition or a physiological state. So that's very similar to the purpose of the SOA section within a CER. The clinical performance is focused on the ability of the IVD to yield a result that's correlated with a clinical condition in a specific target population under normal conditions of use. So those are the definitions of each report, and that should help you guide how and where the clinical evidence that is being described and presented within your PER, where it fits into which of these 3 independent reports. So before we get into the actual types of evidence, let's take a moment to discuss how IVDR defines clinical evidence as a general statement. According to Article 56, clinical evidence shall be such as to scientifically demonstrate by reference to the state of the art in medicine that the intended clinical benefits will be achieved and that the device is safe. The clinical evidence derived from the performance evaluation shall provide scientifically valid assurance that the relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1 are fulfilled under normal condition of use. So again, there's a lot of information packed into their description, but the main takeaway is that you're expected to demonstrate the scientific validity of the IVD, but you should also establish that this device may be considered state of the art when used under very specific conditions. So if we build off of their statement, IVDR also states that a test shall achieve the performances stated by the manufacturer with regards to analytical and clinical performance. So these are the 2 different types of data sets that you should be collecting. Analytical performance, such as analytical sensitivity or analytical specificity, trueness, precision, which includes repeatability and reproducibility, accuracy, limits of detection and quantification, measurement ranges, linearity, cutoff values. All of those help you determine the appropriate criteria for specimen collection and handling and control. And it allows you to discuss things like interference or potential for cross reactions. Those are all comprised within your analytical performance data set. The clinical performance will include things such as diagnostic sensitivity or diagnostic specificity. So they're both sensitivity and specificity definitions, but they have clearly different purposes. This type of data may also include positive predictive value or negative predictive values, likelihood ratios, or expected values in a normal versus an infected population. So this is actually a very common question that we hear from the clients very early in the PER process, is to help them clearly define the difference between analytical and clinical performance. So I want to first point out that the analytical performance and the clinical performance studies ultimately have different objectives and endpoints. So when you read the indicators that are presented within a particular study, that's a pretty solid clue as to what type of data you're actually looking at. Analytical performance studies focus on the analyte, whereas a clinical performance study is focused on the patient. They're intrinsically related though, because analytical performance is the basis of the clinical performance of a device. However, the analytical performance data alone will not demonstrate the clinical performance of a device, and they're assessing ultimately different performance characteristics. For instance, if you have a high analytical sensitivity, that does not necessarily guarantee an acceptable diagnostic sensitivity based on the specific scientific validity of that type of test in a clinical setting. So indicators of analytical performance are typically pretty similar or maybe even identical across multiple IVD devices. Guidance is provided by the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, or CLSI, documents. And conversely, indicators of clinical performance can vary and depend strongly on your intended purpose. Specifically, the clinical function in the intended purpose or use will define the study endpoint or the clinical performance data type. For instance, are you looking for diagnostic sensitivity and specificity, or the clinical sensitivity for a test? Because that, if the diagnostic intended purpose and the hazard ratio is presented, that could be an indication that that test is claiming a prognostic intended purpose. So there are quite a few different, this is why it all comes back to clearly defining your intended purpose very early on in the process, because that will help you identify what are going to be the proper clinical performance indicators that you would want to capture within your own data extractions and your data analyses. So specifically, the term clinical study by itself, if they have not clearly specified if it's an analytical or a clinical performance study, that can be confusing. And it's sometimes applied to any study that uses a patient sample or a clinical sample, independent of the performance indicators that have actually been presented. So just remember that an analytical performance study that uses patient samples is not a source of clinical performance data. So the recommendation, therefore, is to make sure that you are properly using and distinguishing between the types of data so that they can be presented within the different reports, within the APR and the CPR separately. Okay, so we thought this was a good stopping point or sort of a break point between the clinical data and the state of the art because we've presented quite a few webinars in the past devoted entirely to the SOA section. And I definitely encourage you all to take a look at those for more detailed information. Today, our focus is instead to just briefly describe how the SOA section fits into your overall planning for your PER, and also share some of our common observations based on our experience writing many of these SOA sections over the years. So the state of the art is really a core element of the essential requirements of IVDD. And it remains such as part of the general safety and performance requirements for IVDR. In IVDR Annex 1, they stipulate that the device shall be designed and manufactured in such a way that they are suitable for the purposes as specified and suitable with regard to the performance they're intended to achieve, but also taking into account of the generally acknowledged state of the art. So that's where the whole point of the state of the art comes in. The IVDR puts a lot of emphasis on the clinical relevance of the diagnostic device. So in addition to the generally acknowledged state of the art of the devices and the performance of a device, particularly that clinical evidence and the clinical benefit, all of those need to take into account the state of the art in medicine with regards to this particular clinical field, this particular clinical scenario. And within IVDR, another section of IVDR, within Article 56, they state that the clinical evidence shall be such to scientifically demonstrate by reference to the state of the art in medicine that the intended clinical benefit will be achieved and that the device is safe. So again, it's referring you back to that state of the art in medicine. And that's going to be, this is going to be a very critical component of your writing process in general. So don't overlook this step or don't be so focused on developing all of these clinical data sets that you forget to spend the time developing your SOA section well. The standards that IVDR gives us tell you a few different methods that can be leveraged as you're determining and establishing state of the art for a device. And that can include referring to standards that have been used for same or similar devices, but you have to know what those same or similar devices are. It can also include things like best practices as used in other devices of the same or similar type. The results of accepted scientific research, and that's a big part of your searches that you will conduct in order to establish your competitive landscape. It could include publications from respected authorities in the field or clinical guidelines, or really any other information for similar other products on the market. And then it's also expected to compare the benefits and risks of the device under development with the benefits and risks of similar devices available on the market. In our experience, there are several common gaps that we see in the SOA section, particularly as companies are transitioning their documents from being IVDD compliant to IVDR requirement. These can include issues with your organization and your methodology, and ultimately it comes down to the transparency of the data collection and reporting. So as you're starting this process of developing your SOA section, be prepared early on during the scoping process to clearly identify your PICO terms. These terms will guide your literature searches and will also inform your choice of alternatives and competitors that are presented within the state-of-the-art section. This competitive landscape is where the data for your performance indicators of the competitors is presented. And ultimately, this will be the data used to define the acceptance criteria. So while the APR and the CPR will present data with regards to your device, the SOA is essentially presenting the options for diagnosis, the range of what may be considered acceptable performance within the entire landscape. It's important to ensure that the performance indicators reported for your competitors are also aligned with guidelines and professional standards, but also double check early on that these are actually aligned with the performance indicators that you're collecting as part of your post-market surveillance, your internal clinical studies, and your PMPF plan. And after all of the data has been screened and extracted and analyzed, and you've now separated into the SVR, APR, and CPR, that brings us to the risk-benefit analysis within your PER. Based on our experience, it's possible to devote an entire presentation just to risk-benefit section in the PER. But in our opinion, the risk-benefit analysis section is where the results of the entire evaluation really come together. The safety and performance requirements and the acceptance criteria derived from your state-of-the-art analysis, the analysis of all of the clinical data and the analytical performance data from all sources. All of that information will be synthesized within the risk-benefit analysis section to complete the story. That is, your ultimate purpose is to demonstrate the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile of this device. So that's really the last big piece of this report. The methodology for conducting a risk-benefit analysis includes a description of your internal risk management activities, listing applicable regulations or internal SOPs, a listing of each benefit and risk identified in your analysis of clinical data, and a cross-reference to the original source of that data. And be sure to compare all of these findings to the competitive landscape and the alternatives that were presented in your SOA. Now, specific to IVDR, the clinical benefit may refer to the positive impact for the patient, for patient management, or for public health. And that's important to note. IVDR applies a very specific meaning to the concept of clinical benefit, and it differs from that in MDR that is imposed on therapeutic devices. Both medical devices and IVDs are within the same scope of regulations, but there are elements related to medical devices that would not be relevant for IVDs. For IVDR, unless a clinical benefit is presented in an intended purpose or in a product claim, the downstream clinical benefits are not taken into consideration in a benefit risk analysis. However, downstream risks should be considered as part of the overall risk. So really the good news is that IVDR recognizes that the concept of clinical benefit for an IVD is fundamentally different from that which applies to a pharmaceutical or a therapeutic medical device. That's because the benefit of an IVD medical device lies in its ability to provide accurate medical information on patients where appropriate and should be assessed against other medical information obtained through other diagnostic options and technologies. Whereas the final clinical outcome for the patient is dependent upon those further diagnostic or therapeutic options, which may or may not be available. So rather than requiring each individual benefit and risk to be compared against each other one by one, the regulations for IVDR define the benefit risk determination to be the overall determination. So where an individual critical risk may not meet the initial acceptance criteria, residual risk should be justified and addressed in your description within the risk-benefit analysis. There are regulations within IVDR that state that the overall residual risks should be compared against the benefits of the device to evaluate whether a high risk but highly beneficial device should be marketed. This can come into play if you have a test that is not necessarily the most scientifically advanced, highly accurate test on the market, but it can be conducted in home or in the field compared to a laboratory type of test. The benefit risk analysis should be a description comparing exactly when and where and under what circumstances your device can be considered state of the art. And so that's where you will pull all these sections together into this final analysis. The IVDR is clear in stating that the benefit risk analysis should be carried out under normal conditions of the intended use of your device. So again, we cannot stress enough the importance of clearly defining your intended use, because you will be expected to identify hazards from normal use, but also use that normal use for justification of the risks and the benefits. Some common gaps that we've identified in the risk benefit section through our experience in the CER world is that there is often inadequate detail on internal risk management activities and risk assessment methodologies. It's unclear if the risk profile of the subject device was updated with any new risk information that's been gleaned from review of the clinical literature. So if it appears that there's a feedback loop in place that ensures that any new risk information identified through clinical literature was then fed back into your internal risk management processes, that's important to make clear. The presentation and the analysis of both the benefits and the risks may be disorganized or difficult to follow, or worse than that, if your conclusion is not supported by the clinical data that you've presented in other sections, that's problematic. And then finally, we often see that there's not really a definitive conclusion statement that simply states the acceptability of the benefit risk profile on the device under evaluation. So we suggest that it's important to focus on those details. You need to break it down for the reviewer. You want to provide details and a short description of the risk management processes in place within your company. State that these risk management procedures were adhered to for this particular clinical evaluation, and that there should be a point-by-point presentation and a discussion of the contribution of all available clinical data sets within this risk-benefit analysis. That helps you determine the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile across multiple indications potentially, and for multiple intended purposes of the device. You cannot simply expect to be able to state that my device has been on the market for X number of years and use that as a justification. It must be broken down for indications and intended purposes. And then finally, don't forget to include a clear, definitive conclusion statement of the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile of the device under evaluation. So here at the final step, we want to make sure that you've had a chance to tie it all together with analyses and conclusions for your PER. So there's really not a doubt that the PER is going to be very complicated to organize and to write. So I want to start this discussion by stating my own personal opinion that it definitely takes a very talented, organized writer on your team to prepare, organize, and present all of these different sources of clinical and technical data, because they've been derived from different data sets. And you must be able and prepared to then analyze those data sets against complicated performance criteria. And at the end, you need to be able to draw scientifically sound conclusions as to the acceptability of the device under evaluation. This is often not a task that can be easily accomplished by a single writer or even a team of writers if they don't have the individual experience of thinking about this from the holistic approach, from the entire PER. Many of our gap analyses observations have to do with the presentation and the organizational skills that are built into the PER itself. So if you have unclear presentation of your clinical data, that may lead to your conclusions being poorly documented. If it's not readable, that can make it also unclear and could lead to faulty conclusions. And be sure that you've included all data sets that have been analyzed against the performance objectives and these acceptance criteria. Sometimes the discussions lack specificity or data support, or a clear summary statement can go a long way. So be sure that you've clearly organized and supported the statements to sort of tie these data sets together. And finally, if there's no summary conclusion statement that establishes that your subject device is state of the art, or that it meets all applicable requirements in this evaluation, that can also be difficult. So we suggest that you critically evaluate early in the process the template for your device, and update it as needed to make sure that it is compliant with the current guidelines. To early in the process, establish device-specific and robust performance indicators so that your acceptance criteria will have quantifiable upper and lower bounds, and to apply the highest standards of scientific rigor to each and every element within the PER process and the report as a whole. And then finally, you want to ensure that your overall conclusion is supported by each separate section's summary conclusions. So I thought I would conclude with just taking a statement that actually is derived from MedDev Rev 4, and it is with regards to the clinical evaluation reports. They state that the clinical evaluation report should contain sufficient information to be read and understood by an independent party, such as a regulatory authority or a notified body. So as you're evaluating your own PER, ask yourself these questions. Is there sufficient information within this report? Can the report be read and understood by an independent third party that does not know your company's device as well as you do? So those are really the two guiding benchmark principles to assess your own state of your PER against. Is there data sufficiency, and is the data presented understandable and easily presented in a very clear and organized way?
All right, thank you, Sarah. We hope that at this point you understand how to assess your performance evaluation processes and PER document for possible gaps within IVDR requirements, as well as how logical document organization, complete documentation and methodology, and clearly stated conclusion statements are critical to the success of your PER. If not, now is the time to ask your questions. We have about 20 minutes here to answer your questions, and joining us now is President Lori Mitchell. Lori, how are you?
Thanks everyone for joining today, and we appreciate your time. I think we're going to move on to questions now, Olivia. I'm sorry, is that what we're going to do next?
Yeah, let's get to our first question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, for your all your insights, and I hope that the content was useful to everyone who attended. So yes, so Sarah, let's move on to questions.
All right, our first question today is, what is the recommended most efficient approach?
So this, I think, really comes down to scoping. Very early when we meet with a new company, we need to know a lot about what their device is, how it performs. So we developed a scoping checklist that we use to help us ask the right questions to ensure that we've accurately reflected your device. There's no way we can know your device as well as you do. So, but what it comes down to is knowing the types of questions to ask to identify what types of information are available, where there may be potential gaps in the information, and just to get a true sense of sort of the overall scope and the purpose of your particular device so that we can accurately reflect that in our searches and in the choice of alternatives and competitors. So proper scoping goes a very long way to keeping the process on track and ensuring that you can meet the target deadlines.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. How do you scale with multiple products?
This has also come up in quite a few of our projects. Like, let's say you have a test and then you have the control for that test. If you have two similar devices that would have sort of a shared common indication or a shared medical condition, there are some points of overlap, and that can get written into the initial planning stages. So as you're developing your SOA section, you can certainly use some of the material from one report for another report to help support it. It's all about identifying the scope for each of the products and looking for that overlap as part of your early scoping process to sort of build in those efficiencies early on, or to help you develop search strategies that are designed to capture multiple products or look for points of overlap.
All right. Here's our next question. To what extent does a device being Class A affect the requirements? What are the major differences for this class?
So I think it's helpful just for folks who are not as familiar with the classes. When you have a Class A device, it's basically going to be something that you would have certain requirements for. They often fall into, classes where they're sort of like reagents. There's something a little bit more straightforward. So that can be really challenging. From what we've deduced, in most cases, a Class A you would not expect to have clinical performance studies. So a CPR may not be required for a Class A device, but the clinical evidence is still expected to be compiled. So you're still expected to present a thorough scientific validity and an analytical performance. And if you have this clinical evidence that you're compiling, you want to justify the approach that you've taken to generating that evidence, but also support the identification that you are a Class A. Class A devices you have to be able to support that and verify your assertion that you are a particular class. So basically, in order to do that, that's where it goes back to the intended purpose of the device. And you still are expected to show the scientific validity and the performance of the device. But be prepared to thoroughly document the classification rules and determine which class is applicable to your device.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I also want to remind all our attendees here today that you can reach out to us at consult@Criterion Edge to learn more about our services or schedule some time to talk to us. And you can also book an appointment using the link in the chat. And I think this is a good follow-up question to the previous one, Sarah. This person wants to understand the different classes of devices under IVDR.
Yes, so this comes into sort of the different levels. The easiest way to think about it is in terms of patient or public health risk. So something that's designated as Class A would be considered to have a low patient or public health risk. So that might be something like a laboratory instrument or a buffer or something to that effect. Whereas a Class B has sort of a moderate patient risk and a low public health risk. So that could be something like a self-test that has less risk to a patient, like a pregnancy test or a fertility test or something along those lines. It's kind of the default for a classification for an IVD if it doesn't seem to fit well under any of the other classification rules. Now, a Class C is where you're getting into an IVD that's intended to be used for detecting an infectious agent without a high risk of propagation. So it's high risk to the patient, but still considered to be moderate public health risk based on sort of the transmissibility of that particular infectious agent. And then once you get up to Class D, that's considered to be an IVD designed to detect a life-threatening transmissible agent or an infectious disease that has a very high risk for spreading. So it has both a high risk to the patient as well as the public health. So it's all about sort of using the 7 classification rules that IVDR sets out to truly assess where your device falls. And it all comes back to that intended purpose and sort of the population that is using your device.
All right, our next question This is a good one, I think. Who in an organization is responsible for scoping?
This can really vary depending on the client. And we've seen the same issues in large companies and small companies. It's kind of a universal thing. When you're scoping, the goal overall and how we define scoping is to develop sort of a list of what information is needed and what information do we have. So to make some of these early decisions right away with the proper people on the call who are sort of approved or designated to make those types of decisions. So we often start with the IFU or any sort of instructions or labels or just sort of some basic information that even protocols for the particular device. And then we may need to follow up with different groups within the organization. In some cases, you may need to reach out to your there may be some internal regulatory team members who can help you with understanding what your classification. There may still be some debate as to whether or not your public health risk is moderate to high. Those types of decisions need to be made within your company prior to writing. So that's all going to play into the scoping. I think it comes down to being organized, having all thorough description of who has what piece of the puzzle, and making sure that all of those documents and sort of the feeder documents are all easily available to whomever is doing the writing.
Great. Here's our next question. If the PER does not cover all claims, can gaps be closed by the PMPF?
So this can be a challenge. And this kind of comes down to the difference between a claim and a purpose. The claims are put out by marketing. And so while your device may be used for a particular indication, or there's no reason why it couldn't do a particular indication, if you do not have data supporting that indication, that can be very problematic when you're doing your CPR. You may need to go in and maybe you can establish equivalence with a prior test and be able to use data from a similar, if you can claim equivalence with another device that's on the market. But if you don't, you may need to plan to conduct some of these clinical studies to be able to fully support all claims. If you have a test that's designed to be used for urine and you're trying to make a claim that now it can also be used for saliva, you are expected to fully support that assertion through your data sets. If all of the data that you've identified that's been published with clinical data is all reported on urine only, and you have APR, your APR can support saliva, but your clinical data really doesn't, that's a pretty big gap. It's not necessarily going to be closed by your plan. It's expected to be addressed within the plan moving forward, that you should be collecting that data moving forward. But you're still going to have to figure out a way around that in terms of getting your initial PER written. If you don't have data, you may not be able to include that particular claim in because it can't be supported by the clinical data.
All right. This person would like to know the PER perspective for a de novo product.
So by de novo, I'm kind of taking that to mean something that's sort of very novel, that there really aren't a lot of comparators or competitors out on the market. So I would take this to mean something that's like maybe a brand new analyte that you've identified, or a biomarker or something to that effect. In that regard, I think it's even more important to have a really solid state-of-the-art section and to have a really solid scientific validity section. You may need to show some preclinical studies that support the scientific validity of that particular analyte to basically help fully tell the story. I would also plan to use the state-of-the-art section as a good place to kind of show the need for a better biomarker, like what is the specific what is available prior to now, and how does your particular de novo product kind of serve an unmet need in terms of diagnostic capabilities. That could be that would be the approach that I would take, because you're going to be limited by your competitive landscape if no one else is doing something exactly similar, if you don't have any direct competitors. In that case, you would have to basically look at what would be the alternatives for making a similar type of diagnostic, like a diagnosis or making a prognosis or something to that effect. So it's going to require some careful thought to developing your alternatives and really fleshing all of this out within your SOA section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was some great advice. Thanks, Sarah. We have a few more minutes here, so if you're still holding on to your questions, be sure to send them in using the Q&A button. Here's our next one. Does one need a specific performance evaluation SOP for compliance to IVDR?
Yeah, I think this goes into that scoping that we've discussed early on. Having your SOPs in place prior to even beginning is going to be very, very helpful. That can definitely delay the entire process. So making sure that you have these available, that they've been supplied by anyone within the company who's in charge of developing these different documents, like the SOPs, that's a critical sort of scoping step, I would say.
Mm-hmm. This next person would like to know how to write a PER for a Class A general device when no clinical validation is possible. Any advice here?
Yeah, so this definitely has come up because I think particularly for the Class A folks, they seem to be the most sort of terrified by this whole prospect, because in many cases, you've never had to justify some simple reagent like PBS or a media buffer or something like that. So the important thing to remember, though, is that you're still expected to meet these requirements. You still have to submit a PER. You may be able to justify that you are not required to submit a CPR, but that should be something that you should justify within your PER as a whole. You should explain sort of why you're not subject to the clinical performance requirements. But in terms of scientific validity and the analytical performance, all of that is still expected to be clearly presented. And even within the state-of-the-art section, you may have some challenges identifying your competitors, but you'll be relying heavily on that analytical performance data. And so all of the pieces still need to be in there. They just may be a little bit less because you don't have the clinical performance data also wrapped into the whole report. But in terms of the major subheadings and the sections within the PER, the CPR is going to be the major point where it kind of diverges compared to Class B, C, or D devices.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Here's our next question. What are the key clinical pieces deemed necessary and IVDD usable parts to support the PER and enable a successful submission?
Yeah, we've kind of covered this, I hope, in today's webinar. Really, it's going to come down to knowing your data sources and knowing what types of information you need to garner out of each of those data sets. So you can, within IVDD, you still had an SOA section, or at least the beginnings of an SOA section. You may have presented the clinical scenarios by which your device is used and things like that. But IVDR is holding you to a higher standard in that it needs to be very well documented. It should be appraised, and the data, the whole methodology for developing these searches should be very well documented and described. You're also expected to have that landscape section, which I'm finding a lot of IVDD documents are not really fully what they're expecting to see. in terms of the landscape analysis and properly identifying competitor devices. So it's going to come down to sort of the organization and the structure, but also the transparency of reporting your method for determining all of this information. And unfortunately, for a lot of the IVDD people, they have these reports written, but how the articles were identified has not been documented up until this point. So it is going to require that extra level of rigor compared to what we're sort of used to. It's kind of the difference between writing a review article or writing a systematic literature review article. In an SLR, you're going to document the process. You're not just sort of selecting articles that support your premise, but one at a time, like cherry picking the articles. You need to fully support and show that you've done a thorough assessment of all of the literature in an unbiased way.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's our last question. This person is interested in checklist preparation and how to set deadlines for other departments. What can you say about this, Sarah?
Yeah, that's basically what I would highly suggest developing this within your team, or to be prepared to have your writing team have these deadlines set early. I do find if you expect something to take a week, plan for 2 to 3. Everything seems to take longer, particularly if documents are housed within different departments and different divisions within your company. So setting a checklist early on what are the inputs that I need, who has them, and how soon do I need them? I would always tell them you need them at least a week or two prior to when you actually need them to ensure that you can meet the deadlines and stay on track. The timelines are tight, and you're not going to be able to pull this together in a week or two. It's going to be several weeks for even an experienced writing team. So having an organization and someone who's in charge and keeping those deadlines on track is going to be extremely critical.
All right, we are out of time. Go ahead,
Hey, Olivia, I just thought I'd just jump in really quickly and just put a kind of an exclamation point on the notion of time with this group here. And this is one of the reasons that we put together this particular topic, is this early planning and prep, which is all about time and preparation. So there's time, there's bandwidth issues, there's resource issues, there's expertise issues. All those problems have to be solved for along the way. So we hope this has been helpful to you, but we can't overemphasize the preparation taking time into the mix. There's going to be a lot of breaking news and new guidances, or I mean new suggestions coming out of the notified bodies as they begin to start reviewing PERs and a lot of these documents. So we'll all be doing a lot of adjusting in the next year or two and even beyond as we get more notified body feedback, and adjusting and recalibrating some processes, templates, and so forth also takes time. So Sarah, I just want to thank you again and thank everybody for showing up today. We hope it's been useful. Olivia, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Lori. For more questions on the content we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn more about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with us. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and for your wonderful questions. We hope this presentation helps you get one step closer to IVDR readiness. Take care, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.